Hi, friends. I know you missed me so much, or are missing me so much today. Hopefully, math went good. Hopefully, language went good this morning. You're going to listen to me, read the book, and ask questions along the way. Make sure you're paying attention because you are going to have an assignment once I'm finished reading, and you are going to be doing that over our story. So, I know some of you guys have been hating on our book, but I think this is such a good book. It just is so good. Like, Virgil, he is just MIA. And Valentia officially knows who Virgil is, though. She saw that picture in his house. He's at the bottom of his well. Or of the well. You know, guinea pig in Valencia. Or, oh my goodness, what is Mrs. Kneifel saying? Valencia once had a guinea pig. Virgil has a guinea pig now. It's crazy. So we are going to start on 218. Even though I'm not in the class to see you, you should still be following along with me. We're going to see how far we can get today. We're going to try to get a little bit pretty far. Then you will have, like I said, questions to answer over the story. So 30. Dun 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 dun. There are so many things you could do with a stick. That's why Chet likes sticks so much. You could poke and hit stuff. You could swing it around like a weapon, but most importantly, at least for today, you could root out snakes. He hadn't seen a single snakeskin. He should have taken Davies with him and demanded that he point out exactly where he had found it. That would set him straight. Only Chet didn't want to share the spotlight when he captured the real snake. That glory would be his and his alone. He imagined just how it would go, him trying to tying it out in the pillowcase with the snake wiggling inside, then carrying the sack home like a triumphant bounty hunter. He would insist on keeping it as a pet, and once it was coiled inside its tank, he would call Davies right over and show him what he'd done with his bare hands. And that's exactly what he'd say too. I caught it with my bare hands. Chet wasn't sure how his parents would feel about keeping a snake in the house. He could probably talk his mother into it. He seemed to be able to talk her into anything, especially if his father backed him up. But he didn't know how his father felt about snakes. Chet liked to think his father wasn't afraid of anything, but he knew that everyone had their weaknesses. Even him. Chet would never tell anyone this in a million years, but despite being the bravest person he knew, he was afraid of dogs. Not little pipsqueak ones like chihuahuas. He could feed one of those to his snake. No problem. No, it was the big ones that made him uneasy. So fun fact, Chet doesn't like dogs. We didn't know that. So, Chet, not a fan of dogs. Also, Chet, still obsessed trying to find this snakeskin. Like, give up. So he's still in the woods currently. So, Virgil's at the bottom of the well, and Chet is still technically in the woods. So that's something to keep in mind. There were a few other things he was afraid of too, like the fact that he might not make the basketball team, no matter how hard he practiced. He'd already failed at Little League, never hit the ball, not even once. The Boyd Middle School didn't have football, so that would have to wait. Basketball was his best shot at becoming an athlete. You might as well do nothing if you don't excel at something. That was one of his dad's favorite expressions, and right now Chet was batting average at everything. Basketball could change that. The snake could too. That's why he had a backup plan in case his parents wouldn't let him keep it. He would ask his father to take a picture of him holding it up, and the way the fishermen did with their big catches. He would text the picture to Davies with something clever like, "So, you found a snakeskin, huh? Why don't you tell me the story again?" Chet mentally created a series of clever texts as he walked through the woods with his stick and pillowcase. He scanned the ground as he went, looking for places snakes might be, like big thickets or brush where it was easy to hide. "But you can't hide from me," Chet bellowed as if snakes spoke English. Okay, first off, I don't know if you know anything about snakes or reptiles or other, even like squirrels and stuff in the woods. Yelling is not the way to get them to hang around. If it's a snake is hearing you stomp through the woods and hearing the vibrations of your voice, the snake's going to slither away. Yelling at him, stomping through the woods, poking at things with a stick is not the way to get a snake to hang out. Crazy. He wondered what he would name it if it's after its capture. What is a good name for a snake? Killer? No, too juvenile. Cobra? Too obvious. Chet said, jabbing a mound of leaves by the base of a tree. Maybe Smog. Yes, Smog. That sounded both threatening and snake-like. Besides, dragons and snakes were probably related. But nothing slithered out of the leaves. Chet continued walking and yelling, "Smog! Here, Smog!" like he was calling a kitty. Each time he saw a pile of leaves and twigs, he jabbed and poked and called out for Smog, and his heart didn't even pound. He was really made of some tough stuff. And then there was a ruffling in the leaves, similar to what he'd heard when he discovered that girl Valencia. He stopped and looked around. It was hard to tell where the sound was coming from, but he couldn't hear it anymore. He suddenly got the distinct feeling that he was being watched by someone or something. "Hello?" he said. His voice sounded weak, so he tried to give it more gusto. "Is anyone there?" No answer. So more gusto would be like, a little bit firmer. What if that deaf girl was hiding in the trees? What if she was putting a hex on him? He waited. When nothing happened, he rolled his eyes and mumbled, "Whatever." He poked the leaves with his stick and heard something, this time from the ground. He paused, poked again. He took a step closer, so the toes of his sneakers brushed against the pile of leaves. He definitely heard something move in there. His body rushed with adrenaline. Goosebumps exploded across both arms, even though it was 1,000,000 degrees outside. Hey, you want to know a fun fact? So goosebumps actually don't have bumps like that. Ducks do. So I don't know why people call them goosebumps, because they should really be called duck bumps, because ducks are the ones that get bumps, but totally besides the point. He tightened his grip on the stick and swept it at the leaves. He hadn't expected to find anything, really. Yes, he was on a snake hunt, but he'd been at it for hours, and now it's just become something to do. He didn't realize that he no longer expected to find Smog until he actually found him. The snake immediately lifted its head. It was the width of a garden hose, but not very long. At that moment, Chet realized how little he actually knew about snakes. He knew how he would grab it by the tail, of course, so he wouldn't have to put his hand near the snake's mouth, but he had no clue whether it was poisonous or not. Could snakes this small be venomous? How was he supposed to know? Excuse me, Mr. Chet. Remember, we learned from Valencia, you are not to grab a snake by its tail. If you grab a snake by its tail, it can reach back around and bite you. Whether venomous or not, you still don't want to be bitten by a snake. And he's realizing now that he finally found a snake after hours that, he knows nothing about them. Which we could have told him already. Chet, get it together, bud. It probably would have been smart to do some research, but there was no time for that. He couldn't pull out his phone and Google it with Smog's eyes on him. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The snake was exposed, waiting for the capture. This time, the time was now. Chet's heart thundered. Adrenaline, Chet mumbled. No fear, adrenaline. The snake wasn't doing anything, just staring. Not hissing. It didn't sway back and forth like sumo wrestler. It just rested there, head raised. Almost like it was waiting to be picked up and petted. Almost like it was meant to be his pet. Almost like fate. Ooh, there's that coincidence again. Remember, he's looking for snakes, and coincidentally a snake appeared, which after hours of looking, you'd hope one finally showed up. Chet tossed the stick aside and flicked the pillowcase open with one melodramatic motion. So whoosh, melodramatic, okay? He took a big, deep breath and moved closer. The second he leaned in, the snake reared its head back, and Chet wildly grabbed it by its tail, which gave Smog plenty of time and open air to swing around one quick motion and sink its fangs into the thick and rubbery skin of the bull's right forearm. So literally, just what we talked about. He grabbed the snake, and the snake, whipped around, bit him. It felt like the claws of a kitten digging into him. He knew what that felt like. His cousin had a vicious cat. But cats are one thing, and snakes were quite another, so he immediately dropped Smog and howled, certain he would die in less than 5 minutes. His forearm turned pink right away. His skin burned. He imagined the poison traveling through his veins and attacking his heart. Who would find his body? That deaf girl? That our boy? And would they know how he died? If one of them found him, he'd at least like them to know that he died in a life-or-death fight with a vicious reptile. Was this reptile vicious? Absolutely not. This reptile was minding his own business under some leaves. Chet is the one that came at the reptile. So that's important to remember. It's not the reptile's fault in this situation. It is definitely Chet's. He cradled his arm and stared at it. The pillowcase was crumbled in the leaves like a deflated balloon, and he suddenly realized that he had no idea where Smog had gone. The snake had vanished. Chet walked about 20 feet from the scene of the attack, searching for it. Then he sat at the base of the sturdy pine tree and waited to die. So he's convinced, like, was bit, and now I'm gonna die. So that does suck that he was bit by a snake. But you know why he was bit by a snake? Because he didn't do his research. He thought he knew best. He thought he knew how to handle snakes, went in and tried, and then he got hurt. Who could have predicted that? Like all of us, probably. Chapter 31, 227. Unpredictable happenings. Virgil wasn't home, which meant he's in trouble. I know it, said Kaori. We need to have the ceremony. After they returned from Virgil's house, they'd collapsed on the floor in the Tanica's living room to discuss their next plan of action. They'd also turned on the television, which had lured Jen's attention away. All for the better, as far as Kaori was concerned. Who needs the insight of a child where matters of life and death are at stake? So Kaori turned on the TV, and her little sister's instantly more intrigued in the TV than what they're doing. But she's considering this a life and death thing about Virgil. She doesn't know he's at the bottom of the well. I guess it could be a life or death thing. She's just automatically assuming, he's not at home. It's been over 2 hours. It must be life or death. This isn't like Virgil. Just Renee frowned at the TV and said, "It's hard for me to make out sounds with the TV on the background. Makes everything garbled." She wiggled her hands around her ears as if it was a universal sign for garbled. "Do you mind if we lower it?" Kaori glared at her sister. "Turn that thing down." Jen muted it, but didn't look away. "Did you say something about a ceremony?" Renee asked Kaori. Kaori's face turned serious. She straightened her back and folded her hands in her lap. Also, if you remember, Valencia goes by Renee to Kaori. She still hasn't told her real name. It's just Renee. "The ceremony of lost things," Kaori said solemnly. "It's a ritual to help us find Virgil. But we can't do it here. We have to go into the woods. The ceremony only works if you're one with nature, and this certainly isn't nature." She gestured towards the television. Interesting. They have to go in the woods. Who's in the woods? Virgil. Who else is in the woods? Jen. The clock on the wall, a hideously ugly and practical thing, in Kaori's opinion, said it was 2:19. She wondered how long people had to be lost to be considered a missing person. It hadn't been that long, but a lot of bad things could happen in 3 hours and 19 minutes. Kaori anticipated just Renee's next question. What's the ceremony of lost things? Truth be told, Kaori had no idea. She was sure there was a proper ceremony that could help gifted mediums find lost items or people. She just didn't know what it was. No matter. She would figure out when she went along. The ancestors would guide her. So, Virgil is lost. Kaori thinks she, or is this psychic. And they're going to have a ceremony for lost things. And she literally does not know what the ceremony is supposed to be. She's just assuming there must be a ceremony for psychics, or mediums is another name for them, to, find lost things. So she's just going to figure it out along the way. But she knows you have to be one with nature. So once again, she's just flying by the seat of her pants. What is she? I don't know. She is a little bit crazy for me, I think. There were no time to explain all the details, said Kaori. She stood up quickly and snapped her fingers in her sister's direction. Jen turned her head, but not her eyes, from the TV. Kaori sighed. Really, Jen was more trouble than she was worth sometimes. Kaori had explained that television was too practical, too traditional, too everyday for the Tanica's daughters, but the poor girl didn't seem to get it. "Jen," said Kaori, "get Mom's secret matches. We're going into the woods." Okay, now we're taking matches into the wood. Fun fact, you should probably never light matches in the woods, because that's a good way to start a forest fire, and forest fires can lead to insane damage and loss of property in people's lives. So don't take matches into the forest. In fact, don't play matches at all. Play with matches at all. You should only have a match if you are using if you have the supervision of an adult. That's Mrs. Kneiffel's public service announcement. Mrs. Tanica kept a box of matches in the second drawer under the microwave. She used them to light her secret cigarettes, the ones she thought she was hiding from her daughters. As if. "You can't hide anything from me, Mother," Kaori had said once. "I inherited the second sight." "Inherited from who?" her mother had asked. No one on either side of the family has ever been remotely interested in such things. Mrs. Tanica had no appreciation for bloodlines or former lives, the kind of stretched back generations, the ones that no one knew about. When Kaori imagined her birth, she pictured herself emerging from a patch of lavender, dark-haired and full of rage at the injustice of her past lives, of which there were two. The first time she walked on Earth, she had been in ancient Egypt. She knew this because it came to her in a dream. She saw herself slipping between the pyramids in a long white robe. What other explanation was there except that she had once walked through the pyramids in real life? So Kaori apparently takes her dreams real serious. Mrs. Kneifel has crazy, I have nightmares all the time, but I have crazy dreams all the time. If I believe every nightmare I've been a part of, every dream I've been a part of, I must have had 5 million past lives. Not really, that's an exaggeration, but I just had a dream the other day that I was in a garage, which was my brother's best friend, childhood best friend, and there was like 30 kayaks. Does that mean I was a kayaker in my past life? No. But she really believes in past lives. She had a dream. She was in ancient Egypt, apparently, by the pyramids, so now she's convinced that she once walked among ancient Egypt. In her second life, she was a freedom fighter in Bangladesh. She knew this because she'd once seen a snippet of the documentary on television, and they showed images of Bangladesh, which looked really familiar to her, and she couldn't explain why. She probably could have learned more if her father hadn't switched the channel. She tried to explain that the documentary was necessary for her to explore past life transgressions, but he said it was March Madness, and past life transgressions didn't happen during college basketball season. Just because her parents didn't know about her secret heritage and magical and mystical powers didn't make them not so. Besides, her parents had always been monstrously unimaginative. Take the smoking, for instance. Mrs. Tanaka smoked 1 or 2 cigarettes a week on the back patio, but she failed to consider that Kaori's bedroom window was usually downwind, which meant the smoke blew right by the secret chamber. Clueless. Jen didn't make a move for the matches right away. Instead, she took her precious time getting up so she could catch the end of her show. She didn't get the fire under her until Kaori snapped again. Life-saving missions don't wait for commercial breaks, you know, she said. Besides, we need to hurry before Mr. and Mrs. Tanaka get home. Jen was still dragging her feet at this. Renee strolled towards the door with her bag slung over her shoulder. Kaori snatched one of her mother's decorative candles out of the candlestick on the table, stuck it in her back pocket, and followed Just Renee outside. So they're taking a candle, matches, and themselves to the woods. Once again, don't take matches to woods. Once the door opened, Jen picked up the pace. She grabbed her jump rope and slung it over her shoulder. Why do you bring that thing everywhere we go? Asked Kaori. It's not as if we're going to jump rope through the trees. You never know when you might need a jump rope, said Jen. Kaori rolled her eyes. Really, you are a wonder. She took the matches from her little sister, and the 3 of them stepped into the blazing hot sun. It's hot, Jen said. We should cook an egg. She'd heard somewhere that it was possible to cook an egg on a car or cement if it was hot enough outside. But she'd been needling Kaori about it ever since. We don't have time for science experiments, said Kaori. She locked the front door and shoved the house key deep into her pocket. Just Renee was already a few feet ahead, making her way towards the street. It only takes 2 seconds to crack an egg, Jen said. Okay, so once again, this is Jen totally, like, Kaori is dead set. Like, we need to help Virgil. Something is wrong with Virgil. And Jen is like, let's crack an egg. It's hot out. We should see if it cooks, which I've heard that works. I don't know. I mean, would it work? How hot it is there? I don't know. And then she's like, we don't have time. And it takes 2 seconds to crack an egg. Like, she is, once again, she's really worried about, like, what she wants to do. She doesn't really see the whole big picture. Like, Virgil really could be in trouble, like Kaori sees. How could you think about eggs at a time like this, Kaori said. She and Jen followed Just Renee, who stopped at the Tanaka's mailbox to wait. I bet he's okay, said Jen. He probably just forgot. What's the worst thing that could have happened? You don't want me to answer that, Kaori said. Where are we going exactly? Asked Just Renee. Yeah, said Jen. Where are we going with matches and a candle exactly? Kaori pointed straight ahead without breaking her stride, like a general leading her troops into battle. That way, she said. As they crossed the street and entered the woods side by side, Jen tugged at Renee's sleeve. Do your hearing aids hurt? She asked. Sometimes they itch or make a dent in my ear. Hurts a little, Renee said. The trees brought much-needed shade from the heat. Kaori took notes of their surroundings, thinking. She wasn't very familiar with the woods. Truth be told, they creeped her out. The woods were full of unpredictable things. Snapping creatures, falling branches, stinging insects. She preferred the comfort of home, where she always knew what to expect. But what choice did she have? It's not like they were going to find Virgil hiding under one of the sofa cushions. Why do you still have to read lips if you have hearing aids? Asked Jen. twigs crunched under their feet. They don't make me hear everything clearly the way you do. I have to fit the sounds with the shape of the lips, make, like a puzzle, Renee said, looking from Jen to the woods. And I have to fit the sounds and the shapes with the situation, because so many words look the same when you read lips, like Matt and Mad and Pat and Pat. Were you born deaf? No, I could hear little. That's how I learned to talk, but then it went away mostly. I wonder if mine will go away. Doubtful. Could you read lips from far away if you had binoculars or a telescope? Kaori couldn't take it anymore. How was she supposed to come one with the forest if Jen kept talking? Stop asking so many questions, Kaori snapped. She heard buzzing near her ear and swatted at it. Jen blinked at her. Why? Remember, little kids love to ask questions because they're curious. And the questions she's asking, Valencia, don't necessarily seem rude to me. She's a younger child and she's curious about what it's like to be deaf. And Valencia probably answers these questions all the time. So I don't really think there's anything wrong with these questions, but it's apparently not the right time for Miss Kaori to be hearing these questions. Because it's rude. Just Renee doesn't mind. Jen looked up at their new client and tapped her hand. Do you? I mind, Kaori said. We need to stay focused and your paddling isn't helping. Kaori didn't want to admit it, but she liked having Jen as her second in command, which meant she was always first in command, which meant she needed to be in charge. But Just Renee seemed to be a natural take charge person. She was leading the way, even though she had no idea what they were supposed to be looking for. Kaori would bet money she was a Leo. Let's stop here, Kaori said. Jen stopped, then Just Renee. They both looked at Kaori curiously. To properly conduct the ceremony, we need a special type of stone, said Kaori, with as much authority as she could. Like the 5 stones you told Virgil to get? Jen asked. What 5 stones? Asked Just Renee, looking from little sister to big sister. Kaori ignored the question. There was no time to explain minor details. We only need one. It's called a snakeskin agate. Just Renee tilted her head. Did you say we need a snakeskin agate? Yes, a snakeskin agate, Kaori repeated. What's that? Asked Jen. It's a stone. It could be as small as a pigeon egg. Kaori opened her empty hand as if the agate would magically appear. It's a rock with scales. That's why it's called snakeskin. Just Renee frowned. We'll never find one of those in these woods. How do you know? Asked Kaori. There's all kinds of rocks and things in here. Because snakeskin agates are usually found in dry riverbeds or along beaches, places where there's water. Just Renee looked around at the dry twigs and towering trees. There definitely isn't any water around here. Jen crossed her arms and raised her eyebrows at Kaori. Now what? And once again, remember, Kaori literally has no reason for needing these specific things. She just, decided these are what, we need to have. Literally. She had just admitted to us earlier she had no idea what this ceremony is supposed to be. Now they're in their woods looking for a rock. And you're probably thinking, well, how the heck does Valencia know where this rock's going to be? Remember, Valencia loves nature. She studies nature constantly. She researches nature constantly. So it's not surprising that she knows that this special type of rock is going to be in a special place near water. So she's kind of outsmarting Miss Kaori right now. Kaori didn't know what to say. For all she knew, Just Renee was right. Kaori had never actually seen a snakeskin agate. After all, but she'd studied endless pages of gems online, and she knew which ones were used for what. The snakeskin agate helped you find lost things, and Virgil was lost. If not to himself, then to her. And as silly and as ridiculous as Virgil was, she wanted to know he was alive and breathing. I suppose we don't necessarily need to find a snakeskin agate precisely, said Kaori. Maybe it's something like it. I mean, it's a gem you're supposed to use, but whatever. I guess we can just get a rock with scales. Something close enough. Maybe our energy will make up for the rest. Jen looked up at Just Renee to gauge her reaction. What do you think? She asked. Kaori frowned. She'd never heard Jen ask anyone else for guidance before, not even their parents. Just Renee studied Jen's face, then looked at Kaori's. A few seconds passed before she asked, if your sister says we need to find a rock with scales, I guess we need to find a rock with scales. Kaori's shoulders relaxed. Something passed between the two older girls then, a mutual understanding that didn't need to be spoken. And Kaori, being a gifted person of the second sight, had great appreciation for such things. She smiled at Just Renee, just a little, just a hand. Just Renee smiled back. That's when they heard the screaming. I swear, this book. It ends on good cliffhangers. If I wanted to stop there, this would be a good place to stop. But I think I'm going to try to get us through another chapter today before you go on with your question. So they're in the woods. I think, like, does Valencia know that Kaori doesn't totally know what's going on? I'm not really sure. But regardless, like, Valencia could see that Kaori was, like, not happy that Jen asked for Valencia's, like, opinion because she'd never done that before. Like, she'd only ever listened to Kaori. And Valencia kind of sensed that. So then she's like, you know, we need to listen to your sister. So now Jen's like, oh, yeah, let's listen to my sister. That's another thing that happens with little kids. Sometimes little kids get excited with new people and, you know, like what new people have to say. So there's this new person in her life randomly today, and she's already, like, wants to ask for her advice. Okay, dun. Now they heard some screaming. Now we are on chapter 32 to 41. If Pa didn't get him first, Virgil figured one of the three things would happen. He could suffocate, starve, or die of thirst. He didn't know which was worse. Well, we know he would die of thirst before he died of starvation, because you can live without food way longer than you can live without water. And suffocate, I don't know how much air flows in there, so I can't answer that one. Maybe all of them would happen. Maybe he wouldn't be able to breathe, and his tummy would rumble until it made his heart stop, and his throat would close up, dry as a bone, and would all happen at the same time. Goodness. How much air was in an abandoned well anyways? Was there a limited supply? Would it eventually run out? Would Pa come back? Remember, Pa is the crazy bird with the wingspan as big as an elephant that, like, freaked him out, but it was all in his brain. And then Ruby San Salvador also came to his brain and helped him calm down. So all these things from his Lola stories are coming to his brain to help him. An army of tears surged up from his gut. He squeezed his eyes shut to stop them from gushing out, then looked up, trying to see if there were ways for air to get inside, but it was completely dark. If light couldn't get in, how would air ever make it? Doesn't matter much, said Virgil, since I'm gonna starve anyways. He fed Gulliver a dandelion. He couldn't see him, but he felt the tug of Gulliver's teeth against the stem and heard a faint munching as he chewed it down. I'm sorry, Gulliver, said Virgil. I got us into a big mess. What happened next was inevitable. It was bound to happen, even if Virgil didn't want it to. Honestly, it would happen to anyone. Virgil began to cry. I'm going to tell you, if I was Virgil, I already would have been crying. If I was stuck at the bottom of a really, really dark well and had no way to get out, I would have already been crying. So, poor Virgil. The tears pushed up from somewhere deep in his belly, shifted into his throat, and dribbled out like water from a leaky faucet. He tried desperately to stop them. He hated crying. He hated how it made his face wet and his eyes puffy and his throat hurt, but there was no stopping it. The tears came harder and with ferocity until the faucet wasn't just leaking, it was pouring, and Virgil had to catch his breath between sobs. Maybe he was being weak, or a baby, or a frightened turtle. So what, though? He was afraid. He was trapped in a pit without a friend in the world, and he was afraid. He'd heard once that before you die, you see your life flash before your eyes. He wasn't exactly dying just yet, but a few flashes came anyway. He thought of Lola. He thought of her hands and how they felt like paper. He thought of all the stories, how she'd complimented his fingers and said he should be a pianist, how she taught him about Pa and the Stone Boy and the Sun Queen. Too bad she never told him the story about how to escape a well. And now she never would. So he's like convinced, like, oh my God, I'm dying. He thought of his parents and brothers, the way they spoke in exclamation points and always teased him for being too shy, too quiet, and how they thought it was silly that he was afraid of the dark. He thought of how he used to imagine that he'd been floating in a river like Moses and his mother just happened to find him. Maybe she'd picked him up and said, "What's this? A baby with no parents? I'll take him home straight away," speaking in exclamation points as usual. And then he went home with her, and everyone realized quickly that he didn't exactly fit in. But that was okay because they loved him anyways. And he'd love them too, of course, even if he didn't understand them. And now he never would. And he thought of Valencia. He wiped his snotty nose with the back of his hands and then wiped them on his pants. Usually he wouldn't do such a thing, but the rules didn't matter now. He was suffocating in a land of lost opportunities where he should have talked to Valencia, told Lola that he loved her, tried to understand his parents and brothers, and thanked Kaori for being such a good friend to him. And now it was too late for any of that. So he's literally thinking of all the things you should do. If you're ever in a situation like that, sometimes like you really do think of regrets. Like he's thinking, oh my gosh, I should have, talked to Valencia. Oh my gosh, I should have said Kaoria, thank you for being my friend. Oh my gosh, I should have said Lola, I love your stories. Like he's thinking, he's like literally convinced that he's going to be stuck down there forever. He might die. So he's really trying to think, like he's thinking of all the regrets, all the things he should have done. Pa would come eventually, he was certain, and even if Pa didn't come, snatching Gulliver as an appetizer before going after the main course, there was still no hope. Virgil took big, heavy breaths. He cried until the faucet ran dry. How could anyone find him? The bull was his only hope for rescue, and there was a fat chance of that happening. The bull had probably forgotten all about him already. Or maybe he was back in the devil's den making a note in his log of the evil deeds. First day of summer. Trapped Virgil, Salinas in a well. Virgil's cheeks ached. His eyes burned. His nose throbbed. Crying hurt. That's why he hated it so much. Crying is good for the soul, said Ruby softly. It means something needs to be released. And if you don't release the something, it just weighs you down until you can hardly move. There's nothing else for me to do, Virgil said. His voice was hoarse from the weeping. You should try yelling again. Virgil pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. What's the point? No one can hear me. Of all the questions you ever ask yourself in life, never ask, what's the point? It's the worst question in the world, Ruby said. You sound like Lola. Good. I miss her, he said quietly, embarrassed even in front of himself. But it needed to be said. When you say things aloud, you let them go. Lola had told him once, but it didn't feel like it worked because he still missed her. It's not like you're never going to see her again, Ruby said. How do you know? No one will ever find me. No one will ever save me. There's no chance. Bellini, of all the things you ever tell yourself in life, never say there's no chance. Okay, it's too late then. Ruby sighed. The sound traveled like a curl of invisible smoke. That's even worse, she said. So remember, Ruby San Salvador is someone in his brain, a strong person from a story that Lola had once told him. So he's saying, what's the point? And there's no chance, and it's too late. And she's saying all these things like, no, don't say those. Don't say those. It's not true. Virgil slumped against the wall. He wanted to sleep through the starvation, but he couldn't, not with Pa out there somewhere. Maybe Pa was just above his head now, watching, waiting to swoop down, circling like a vulture. Virgil didn't dare look up to see. It was too dark anyways, just as Pa liked it. Virgil held his breath. Was that a feather against his cheek? Was that rustling? He put his hands over his ears. Try yelling for help again, Ruby said. I don't want to. It might what? Startle Pa from his invisible perch and send him down for us? I told you, he only grows if you're afraid of him, said Ruby. Ignore Pa. Just yell. Do it for me. Virgil dropped his hands slowly. All was quiet. You can't just give up, Ruby said. There's a time when a person has to give up. That's just the truth. Okay, I'm just going to say, he's giving up awfully quick. I don't really think he's been in the well that long, and he's already ready to give up. So he's feeling seriously defeated. But Ruby, the person in his brain, is like, yeah, we're not giving up. Give me an example, said Ruby. I'm too tired to give examples. Don't avoid the question just because you don't want to think of an answer. Virgil sighed. He thought for a moment. Okay, let's say you're running a race. It's a really, really long race, too. And you sign up because you think you can do it. You practice running for months, maybe even years. And then the big race comes and you're running, and suddenly your legs are really tired. And you're dehydrated, and you can hardly breathe. And the finish line is still way down the road and stuff, but you just can't make it. You start throwing up or something. If you keep going, you know you'll drop dead, so you stop. You sit on the side of the road so you don't die. You have to give up, or else. That's a terrible example, said Ruby immediately. Virgil's eyebrows bunched together. He glared into the darkness. No, it's not. Yes, it is. What makes it a terrible example? Because the person in the story didn't give up. Giving up would have been never starting the race at all. Virgil sighed again. I want to sleep. Will you watch out for me? I will. If you yell for help one last time. Promise? I promise, Bellini. Make it a good one. Virgil took a big, deep breath. He filled his chest with air, opened his mouth wide, and yelled until his voice gave out. All right, that is where we're going to stop reading for today. So in just a minute, Mrs. Couture is going to pass out some questions for you and some review questions and stuff like that. Please be sure to follow every direction. that is on the page, okay? Make sure you look for directions. Make sure you use your book to help you. You should be doing this by yourself. This must be done by lunchtime, which you leave for lunch at 11:15. So it has to be done by then. If you finish early, you need to put your name on it and give it to Mrs. Couture, and then you should be reading a book by yourself or working on flashcards by yourself. Do your personal best. I'm excited to see your guys' answers on these questions. So, see you later. Work on your questions.